really appreciate you joining us today. This is the first of at WSBR's virtual events, and we really appreciate you joining us here today. So we have a very interesting program. We appreciate Dr. Griffin joining us virtually today for an event that we had long scheduled to hold in person, but due to the coronavirus, we needed to move this to a virtual event. Thank you also to Northrop Grumman for being our corporate sponsor of the event today. And so I'd like to kick this off actually by introducing Frank Demoro, who will then introduce Mike Griffin. So first I'd like to introduce Frank. Frank is the Sector Vice President and General Manager of Tactical Space Systems Division for Northrop Grumman's Space Systems Sector. And Frank leads the division for including responsibilities for the company's national security satellites, civil and commercial satellites and spacecraft, and space components and services. The division portfolio includes key space programs such as NASA's commercial resupply services and initiatives, as well as various national security related programs. And Frank works for the company that the legacy portion that Mike previously worked for once upon a time. So Frank, I'll let you introduce Mike.
All right, good morning. Thanks, Aaron. Hi, Mike. Good to see you. And thanks to everybody for joining this morning. I do have the honor of introducing Dr. Mike Griffin, the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering at the U.S. Department of Defense. In Mike's current role, he's the department's Chief Technology Officer, and he's responsible for the research, development, and prototyping activities across the DoD, and is mandated with ensuring technological superiority for the Department of Defense. He oversees the activities at DARPA, the Missile Defense Agency, the Defense Innovation Unit, the DoD Laboratory Enterprise, as well as the Undersecretary staff focused on developing advanced technology and capability for the U.S. military. Now, Mike is very well known, of course, in the industry, and he's covered a lot of waterfront in his career. In academia, Mike served as the Kim McDonald Eminent Scholar and Professor of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at the University of Alabama in Huntsville.
Hey, Frank, we can cut a lot of this short if it's okay with you.
Sure, yeah. Well, the one thing I'll add is, I had the pleasure of working with you, Mike, when you were here at Orbital Sciences Corporation. You were the Chief Technology Officer as well as the VP and GM of the Space Systems Group, a large part of which is now part of my division here at Northrop Grumman. And I'll remember very fondly the time we spent doing early mission operations on the ORBCOMM constellation. I don't no idea if you remember that, but that was a special time for a lot of folks. And I also want to point out the textbook you wrote, the lead writer on the space vehicle design. I have a copy, and that's come in handy over the years. So appreciate, Mike, everything you've done in the industry. I do also, last thing I'll add, amongst a lot of awards that you've received, due to your contributions in the Pluto New Horizons mission, you had an asteroid named after you. I believe it's 159999 Michael Griffin. So that's a pretty cool honor amongst many that you've received in your career. So with that, it is my pleasure to welcome Mike to this virtual session of the Washington Space Business Roundtable.
Thanks, Frank. Yeah, the asteroid thing was pretty neat. I have, in general, I think most people would agree, I've been honored beyond my accomplishments, but you don't turn them down.
Right.
I do remember the first launch of the ORBCOMM constellation quite well. To say that it was a special time is interesting. We launched into an anomaly situation, as you'll recall.
Oh, yeah.
So I had the difficult experience of asking my wife, Rebecca, whom I think everyone in this industry, especially in Washington, also knows. I had to ask her to take our then 4 kids still living at home and schlep them around to the grandparents' house over Christmas, because I think, if I recall correctly, we launched on Christmas Eve or something.
Yep, that's correct.
And I ended up catering dinner from outside sources for the mission operations teams because we couldn't leave. So it took me a while to pile up enough brownie points at home to make up for that one. In fact, I might still be working on it. As with most of you, welcome to my home office here in my Arlington condo for the duration of my appointment, which as a presidential appointee, I think most of you know, is literally at the pleasure of the administration. So we never know if our employment is until tomorrow or next year or anything in between. But that's okay. You don't take these jobs unless you understand that. This is my third time in that arena. I'm just going to talk for a few minutes and then try to leave most of the time for questions. I know I'm already seeing questions pop up in chat or coming direct to me from people who have my private contact information. So I know you all want to ask your own questions and get them answered, and I'll try to do that. So for the Space Business Roundtable, of course, the Research and Engineering Undersecretariat has a lot of things in it that are not space, but it has a lot of things in it that are. Among the space things, of course, are obviously the Missile Defense Agency, which is, flies and fights in space, and our threats come from space or through space, and most of our sensor and communications capability relies on space for its very functions. So not often thought of as a space organization, MDA really is. Then we have, of course, DARPA, and DARPA has a now 60-plus year long history of impact on the space business, starting with, frankly, the Apollo program and the initiation of the F-1 engine that powered the Saturn V. That was a DARPA. That was a DARPA initiative, and looking back on it, it is hard to see how we would have gotten to the moon without that. And of course, DARPA's involvement and legacy in space continues right up to the very present day. Much of it classified, so I won't go into it. But DARPA is a legacy space organization for sure. And then, of course, in our non-legacy crowd, we have Space Development Agency. Created in 2019 by then Acting Secretary Shanahan in one of his bolder moves among several that he initiated. But in this case, an organization created expressly for the purpose of developing a proliferated low orbit constellation of satellites for communications and sensing particularly of hypersonic threats and dim upper stages, which are increasingly a concern. So the Space Development Agency is expressly there for that initial purpose and to do it in a timely way. I think we all know, anyone in this industry knows that the time from initiation of a program until operational capability for most of our large legacy programs is on the order of 15 years. The adversaries, China and Russia, to be blunt about it, are on much shorter timescales. And until and unless we in the DoD and the national security community writ large can learn to operate again on timescales comparable to what the threat is doing, we will always be playing catch-up ball, and that's what the SDA is about. I mentioned hypersonic threats. I think, again, without any reference to anything classified at all, and entirely in the open literature, everyone on this call can avail themselves of the same basic knowledge that I and we in the national security community have, which is that Russia and especially China have developed long-range conventional strike capability with highly maneuverable vehicles that are highly maneuverable in the endgame. The Chinese DF-26, DF-21, if you look at it on the internet, you'll see them referred to as carrier killers. That's not an accident. We need to have a response to that. And the first response would be to know that they're headed our way, which we don't today, because by the time they break the radar horizon, they're within minutes of hitting their target. And that's not enough to close a kill chain. We have to see them from space. especially given that the Western Pacific doesn't have a lot of places for which radars can be sited. And if you could site radars throughout the Western Pacific, the other name for those would be targets. So we need to do it differently, and that's what we're all about in research and engineering. I said I wasn't going to talk much. I don't think anybody wants to hear me pontificate. Most of the people in this industry have heard too much of that from me over the years. I'd rather just devote this time to answering your questions. And since we're not at a Washington Space Business Roundtable luncheon, at which I've appeared possibly too often, we don't need time to eat, and we have more time for questions. So, Erin, if you're the mistress of ceremonies, I'll let you proceed. I'm noticing flashing up on my screen people leaving the meeting, as I said earlier, jokingly, but maybe for real. Once people saw who the speaker was, they decided to bail. They had something more important to do, like washing their hair or trimming their fingernails or whatever.
I don't think so, sir. We still have 104 people here. I think there's a lot of people who are interested in hearing what you have to say. It looks to me like the first person to pose a question was Stephen Trimble. So, Stephen, if you want to unmute your microphone, maybe you can ask the first question.
Please go ahead.
Are you still here? Do you want to ask her a question? If not, I'll move on to the next one. Or do you want me to just ask it for you? Okay, I could read his question. I'd rather let people ask their own questions, but if Stephen's not here, I will ask it for him. He asks, what were the first flight tests of the DARPA TBG and Hawk delayed from 2019? And do you still expect those to occur in FY 2020?
I'm not going to comment on schedules for DARPA programs or schedules in general. We try to protect those, and I'd appreciate it if people didn't go there. I'll get around the issue by saying TBG, Tactical Boost Glide, and Hawk, Hypersonic Air Breathing Weapon Concept, are front and center in our hypersonics program. But like all DARPA programs, they are at the edge of what we believe to be possible. And the trick is to be at the edge and not go over the edge. You need to know which side of the edge you're on. The programs are, I will just say, going well. It should be no surprise to anybody when a DARPA program slips its schedule a bit. I'm tracking both of those programs closely. I'm intensely interested in them. Lisa and Dr. Porter, the Deputy Undersecretary, and I have a TBG review coming up shortly, in fact. So that's all I'm going to say here. The programs are robust. They're funded. They're important. They're running a bit late.
Okay, got it. Thank you. I guess some folks are having a hard time, probably because of the large number of people on the line unmuting their microphones, but we'll see. If Sandra Irwin, I think you're up next to ask a question. Do you want to see if you can answer it? Ask it yourself. If not, then I'll read it for you.
Well, Erin, I'm not going to mute then, because I might not be able to unmute, and then the conference would have to end.
Yourself, sir. Sandra, are you able to unmute? If not, I'll read your question.
Yeah, I think I just unmuted myself. Thank you.
You did. Hi, Sandra.
Good morning, Dr. Griffin. Thank you for doing this. I wanted to ask you about the FCC situation with the hearing that you and other DoD officials testified a couple of weeks ago. There was a lot of discussion about why the FCC decision on Legato was bad for DoD and the impact on GPS. So I'm wondering if you can comment on what are the next steps that DoD is going to be taking, and how do you foresee this issue being resolved? I mean, at some point it probably has to be resolved, or maybe things, will have to be addressed with how GPS will perform in the future. So if you can comment on that, thank you.
Sure, happy to comment. So first of all, R&E, meaning myself and Dr. Porter, we are not primarily, we do not have the responsibility for spectrum management issues within the DoD. So when we engage on this and related activities on broadband utilization across the board, we're doing so from the position of Chief Technical Officer. So that said, the DoD response will be out of the CIO's office. Now, with respect to the testimony and the major issues, look, I mean, this is a fairly simple issue from a technical point of view. So point one is that GPS signals, like all signals from space, are very weak. So they are, like all space signals, assigned to a space communications band, which for decades now has been protected from terrestrial emissions. The Legato Corporation and its precedents has had for decades a license to transmit from space, with which we had no problem. They have sought, and from the FCC recently received, permission to use that same spectrum for terrestrial emitters for purposes of establishing a broadband network. That, as I said in my testimony, and I'm sure anyone here who's interested enough can bring it up online, because those Senate links stay online for quite a while. As I said in my testimony, the net effect is to drown out or to overwhelm the GPS signal in the space communications band with terrestrial emitters by factors of 170 decibels or more. Receivers, that the legacy receivers intended to capture GPS signals were designed with exceptions, but in general were designed under the assumption that nobody would be shouting in their ear from up close. So they're designed with very wide filters to capture as much of the GPS signal across the band as possible. And when other people who are close by are using the band, they're desensitized and drowned out. And that was essentially the conclusion of the Department of Transportation testing, to which I referred in my testimony. That testing was very thorough. So what the department will be seeking in the large is for that FCC decision to be reversed. Now, the FCC reports as an independent agency. They report to Congress, not to the president. They are overseen by Congress, and Congress can, and we hope will, take whatever action is necessary. If the petition for repurposing of the Legato license is allowed to stand, then the 1575 megahertz L1 signal from GPS will be compromised. I pointed out, I think several times in several different places, that the Russian GLONASS system doesn't even use that signal. And of course, the Chinese Beidou system will not be used over the US, or in the US anyway, to any significant extent. And so what we're doing is, by compromising our own system, we're opening the door for adversary radio navigation systems to become world standards instead of what we have today. So that's too long-winded, but there's a certain completeness required, and I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that answer. The next question, it appears, is from Theologus Tilikos. I apologize for butchering your name. Can you unmute your phone and unmute line and ask your question yourself about small sets? Or do you need me to ask it for you?
Why don't you just read it, Aaron?
Okay. What is the role of small sats and in-space sensors for hypersonics and other applications and missions?
Well, the definition of small has changed quite a lot since I first got into the business, but that's okay. Hand in hand with the idea of a constellation, a proliferated constellation whose purpose is to deliver persistent, global, low latency sensing and communications. Such an approach almost automatically implies that if it's going to be affordable, the individual satellites in the constellation have to be considerably less expensive than what we pay for our most sophisticated, largest satellites that are deployed in geostationary orbit. I mean, they have immense capability, but even the United States can only afford a few of them. So it is a truism in aerospace, as in most things, that items cost in proportion to what they weigh. That sounds like an awful oversimplification, and at the detail level it is, but at the, if you're talking about the 80% confidence level on measuring what something costs, tell me what it weighs and tell me what class of object it is, and I'll tell you about what it costs. So our proliferated low Earth orbit constellation for persistent, timely global surveillance and communications has got to consist of satellites which are individually smaller than what we are used to for our legacy constellations. So that's the role of small sats. They're going to be the buses that host these sensors and comms birds. For low Earth orbit constellations, we think that's entirely reasonable because being much closer to the action, we don't need optics that are as large diameter or as heavy or as sophisticated. And for closer up communications, we don't need as much transmitter power and antenna size. So small sat concepts sort of go hand in hand with proliferated low orbit constellations. Now, which vendor of such satellites, or I should say vendors, because I certainly hope not to buy from just one source, which vendors are going to furnish which satellites and for what purposes, that's entirely open. Just because you're a small sat vendor doesn't mean automatically that you're going to win. We will be competing these things, and the competitions are open to all. So I wish all of you collectively good luck because we need you, but I can't comment on any individual potential provider.
Okay, the next question is from Raymond Dubois. If you can unmute your phone, great. Otherwise, I can ask your question for you.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Good morning, Mike.
How are you?
Great.
Another old friend on the call.
Here we go. As you and I discussed a while back, pursuant to David Norquist's memo to establish the Space Advisory Committee under the Defense Innovation Board, I wondered, and you were supposed to, as I gathered, be administratively responsible for it. Has it been established and has the membership been announced?
The Space Advisory Committee underneath the Defense Innovation Board, and I'm choosing my words carefully for obvious reasons, has been established by direction of the Deputy Secretary of Defense, as you mentioned. We are staffing that committee with new members of the Defense Innovation Board. Staffing is certainly not complete. That doesn't go, the various members have to become special government employees, as I'm pretty sure everyone on this call was aware. And that's not an instantaneous process because there has to be considerable vetting for conflict of interests, all of which have to be disclosed, and et cetera. Those of us who've been in or around government for a long time are, I think, broadly familiar with those sorts of processes. The DIB is a FACA committee, Federal Advisory Committee, something or other for the last A, which means that its deliberations have a certain degree of openness in them that is not required of all other entities that advise us. And so when the membership is confirmed, it certainly will be announced, but I would be way ahead of myself if I were to say that we have that membership pinned down today. We don't. R&E is responsible for hosting and housing the Defense Science Board and the Defense Innovation Board, both of those. We have other boards, the Defense Policy Board, Defense Business Board, for which R&E is not the host, but I do have those too. To be the administrative host for such boards is not, and I'll emphasize, is not the same as being in control of them. I'm frequently motivated to say I don't control them and don't want to control them. Advisors whom you can control are of utterly no value. You want advisors who will tell you what they think as the line officials responsible for various activities upon which we might receive advice. Any of us who are responsible for decision making can accept or reject the advice. We're not required to accept it, but I can't reject the advice of which I haven't heard. First you have to tell me what you think before I can argue with you. And I'm not interested, we in the department, broadly speaking, are not interested in advisors who are in any sense under our control. So when people talk about R&E, having control of the DIB or control of the DSB, that's not a place, not a place I want to be.
Thanks so much, Mike. The next question comes from Aaron Mehta. Aaron, can you unmute your phone and ask the question yourself, or would you like me to ask it? Okay, I'll read it for you. And Aaron asks, are you worried about the impact on R&D budgets and FY?
Aaron, you broke off on the last. It says Aaron muted Aaron Neal. That's interesting. I don't know I don't know how to mute you. Aaron,
okay, I'm here again.
Try again.
Here we go. I'll try again. Aaron Mehta asks, are you worried about FY22 budgets and beyond given the current economic situation? And how will you protect R&D funding versus near term requirements?
Well, of course I'm worried. I mean, this is a little like the line in the famous movie Casablanca, I'm shocked to discover gambling in this establishment. We're on a multi-trillion-dollar spending binge to deal with coronavirus. And when the urgent problems of this pandemic are behind us, we're going to have to take stock and figure out how we're going to pay for it all. And I would be very surprised if other budgets across government, not just DoD, not just even the entire national security industry, but I would be very surprised if every government budget was not under siege as we try to grope our way forward in a post-pandemic world. If you're asking me what I think the details of that are going to be, I'm going to punt that question because I have no idea at this point. I and my colleagues on the E-ring of the Pentagon, and frankly, my colleagues in other pieces of government, some of which I used to serve, we're all struggling to figure out what the details are going to be, and I just don't know. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. The next question comes from, every time I get on here, I have to go through. Paul Benfield. Paul, can you unmute your line, ask your question yourself?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Dr. Griffin, for doing this. My question is 2 parts and relates to ABMS. The first part is GAO recently came out with a report fairly critical of it. My first question is, how is R&E supporting ABMS, and do you agree with the criticism from GAO? And the second part of that is, how do you see the other services supporting ABMS/JADC2, or is it, in your opinion, a Air Force-led issue? Thank you.
I don't know enough about ABMS to offer an intelligent comment, and so I'll choose not to offer a stupid comment. I can't comment on the GAO report or Air Force progress with ABMS. You have the wrong speaker. JADC2 is literally Joint All-Domain Command and Control, and we desperately need it. We need to be able to communicate among ourselves, irrespective of what color uniform our force is using, or even if they're using wearing a uniform at all. We need JADC2. We need, frankly, to share it with our allies and partners, because we don't do any good. We don't do any good in trying to fight as coalitions if we can't communicate with each other. So R&E is all in on support of JADC2. It is not just an Air Force show. We're working on 3 critical layers. There's the physical layer convergence that we're trying to achieve, where devices have a lot of commonality and have a lot of their capability being software defined, so that they can be, I'll just say, responsive to change. So physical layer convergence is important to us. There's the network layer. That too is critical. That's how the various devices are going to communicate through the network to each other. The Navy has been heads up on that. And then finally, there's the applications layer, where everybody can play, but I think the Air Force has been heavily invested there. So it is a multi-service effort, and there frankly is a lot of involvement with R&E in terms of what the overall system should look like from a network point of view. I think maybe many of you know that Dr. Michael Zatman is our assistant director for fully networked C-cubed, and he's up to his armpits in JADC2. So as I said, I'll conclude that by repeating myself. We're all in on JADC2.
Thanks, Mike. I think the next question comes from Don Brown. Don, are you able to unmute yourself?
I believe so, Erin. Thank you very much. Thanks for doing this.
Sure.
Thank you. Dr. Griffin, wonder if you'd be kind enough to tell us your view, first, of what is the role of commercial LEO systems in the evolution of the SDA and its space transport layer? And secondly, what is your view of the transition path for Blackjack, assuming it's successful? Does it go to SDA? Does it go to SMC Casino? Could you share some of that with us? Thank you, sir.
Blackjack is a DARPA program, and it is an experiment. We are, I'm not going to go into details here because in an informal environment, it's too easy to step across a classification line. But with Blackjack, we are experimenting explicitly with sensors and communications methods, which, if successful, we believe will feed forward into SDA. DARPA in general and Blackjack in particular are required and expected to be at the state of the art. And as I mentioned earlier, you got to be careful about which side of that edge you're on. We have no intention of having SDA flirt with the edge of the state of the art. By the time we start to build out the various tranches of capability that we want to put forward, we want to know that it can be done. So no, SDA is not taking over a DARPA program. Some of the work DARPA is doing may well transition to SDA. And you asked, what is the role of commercial providers? I am hopeful. Let me try to recast this slightly. I do not have a significant hope that a straight up commercial procurement of somebody's existing satellite bus is going to meet national security needs. That may occur, and that would be great, but we need things that don't necessarily grace a balance sheet very well, that cost money and take time. And that a commercial provider, even if a commercial, even postulating a successful commercial provider, if they're spending their time incorporating a bunch of stuff into their regular bus that the national security community needs, then I would, if I were their CEO, I would wonder, why are you doing that? Because you're paying money for stuff you probably don't need. So, pardon me. Where my hope lies is that we can use commercial manufacturing methods to produce on commercial style manufacturing lines that which DoD needs. So I need to mute for a second here, sorry. I'm talking too much, I'm getting hoarse. Because we simply cannot develop the kinds of persistent global low latency comms and surveillance systems that we need if we're going to continue in the tradition of hand-built or almost hand-built satellites a few at a time. That's just not going to work. So the analogy that I can use many such analogies, but one useful analogy is we are getting an Air Force KC-46 at some point from Boeing, and that airplane is, while uniquely DoD, it is derived from a commercial 767. It's not a purpose-built airplane from scratch. The DoD didn't need that. Another nice analogy is, let's say, a Humvee. There are commercial variants of the Humvee now available, having been derived from DoD requirements, but DoD didn't go to a classic defense prime contractor to build a Humvee. We went to commercial providers of automotive vehicles with different specifications and different needs, and had them use commercial methods and commercial practices to build vehicles that met DoD needs. That's the model I'm looking at, and what I think the role of commercial providers can best be as we flesh out new systems.
Thanks, Mike. Janice, I think you're up next. Are you ready to ask your question? Okay, if not, I can read it for you. Mike, we have another question about legato, but it's from the congressional perspective. I'm going to read Janice's question. She says, are you getting more sanguine about the legislative overturn of the FCC's legato decision? It seemed an uphill fight at first, but there seems to be a mounting number of congressional members who are ready to act. Do you have anything more to add to what you said previously?
Not really. I'm not one to engage in chicken counting. I think across the government, this is protection of GPS is not just and not even mainly, to be honest with you, a DoD issue. Every single relevant department of the executive branch, every piece of the executive branch that had a stake in GPS weighed in against approval of the license modification. DoD is a gorilla in most rooms, but we weren't the only primate. So I'm hopeful that Congress will choose to continue to protect space communications bands for space communications. That's fundamentally what this is about. The threat to GPS is the first, but I wouldn't, if this action goes forward, I wouldn't expect it to be the last threat. Let me stop there.
Got it. Thank you, Mike. So the next question comes from Paul Kirby. Paul, can you ask your question yourself, or do you need me to ask it for you? Oh, wait. That's another question about legato. So I think we'll skip that since it sounds like you've said what you're gonna say.
I don't know anymore.
Got it. Patrick Tucker, are you ready to ask your question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Great.
Yes, okay, great. Thanks, Dr. Griffin, for doing this. So years ago, the Defense Department was talking about onboard directed energy for satellites as a realistic possibility. And since then, the department has kind of backtracked on some studies that looked at directly integrating directed energy onto platforms for missile defense and has put a lot more of its focus on the question of scaling fiber lasers up to a desirable point. So my question is, based on what you've seen in that laser scaling research, are you still convinced that onboard directed energy for satellites is feasible? And from this moment right now in 2020 with budgets and COVID-19 and the current state of the technology, what do you see as the path forward in terms of timescale and logistics for incorporating directed energy onto new satellites? Thanks.
I'm pausing because I'm trying to be careful in what I say. We are investing in fiber laser research. We are investing in diode pumped alkaline laser research. We're investing in slab lasers. These are at technology levels where they are variously capable of output power in the several tens of kilowatts to low hundreds of kilowatts range. That's getting big enough to be worthy of consideration as a weapon in certain applications. We have, for budgetary reasons, had to cut back on some of our laser scaling efforts because there is always a totem pole of priorities and always a set of urgent needs that tend to drown out some of the longer term needs. But we're certainly not giving up on directed energy. One of the things that in R&E we are focusing on, and that I think, frankly, is well overdue, and some of the reason why it's overdue is my fault. But we have not invested enough on understanding lethality and the different modes of lethality for directed energy. We've not invested enough in the operational studies that, if I gave a warfighter a weapon of X number of kilowatts, how and in what circumstances could you use it, and where is it better than a kinetic weapon and where is it not? the operational assessments just have not received as much attention as they should. And then there are physics considerations. And engineering considerations. I'm extremely skeptical that we can put a large laser on an aircraft and use it to shoot down an adversary missile, even from fairly close. I think it can and has been, it can be and has been done as an experiment, but as a weapon system, to equip an airplane with the kinds of lasers we think necessary in terms of their power level and all their support requirements, and get the airplane to altitudes where atmospheric turbulence can be mitigated appropriately, that combination of things doesn't go on one platform. So I'm just extremely skeptical of that. So we're not spending money on. You mentioned in your question, and I want to put an end to that discussion. We're not investing in airborne platforms for shooting down adversary missiles. We do think there are applications for space platforms that could well be quite productive. So, next question.
Thanks, Mike. I think the next question is from Brendan Curry. Brendan, can you ask your question yourself? If not, I'll read it for him. Okay, I'll read it. Brendan typed a couple different questions, so let me see if I can read both of them. First, he asked, how or why are Russia and China able to develop systems faster than us? And then he also asked, we are dealing with a worldwide disaster. An asteroid strike is a somewhat preventable disaster. Is planetary defense something that the Space Advisory Committee will contemplate?
I don't know what the Space Advisory Committee would contemplate. It's not my job to tell them what to contemplate. I would doubt that planetary defense and asteroid defense rises immediately to the top of their pile.
Okay. So next is Christopher Barron. Are you able to ask your own question, Christopher? Okay, if not, I can read your question. Christopher, sorry, I'm having to flip up and down. He says, what is your perspective of the role of SATCOM in 5G architectures, especially for U.S. government needs?
Just say that again, Aaron. I need to get my head around it.
Sorry, it's okay. Sorry. He says, what is your perspective of the role of SATCOM in 5G architectures, especially for U.S. government needs?
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to punt on that. I'm not the 5G specialist in R&E, and I don't have a good answer for how SATCOM plays with that. I'd rather just say I don't know.
Got it. Okay, Hope, are you able to ask your own question, or do you want me to read it for you?
Yes, I can ask my question.
Got it. Great.
Hi, sir. How are you today? I would love
I'm
to
fine.
Thank you. I would love to ask a question that is more of your perhaps personal stance. And the Department of Commerce just released new regulations for space, commercial space. Do you think it helps the U.S. lead global innovation while also being vigilant about national security? And sometimes the devil is in the execution. So is there anything particular you'd like to see happen in the execution of that policy?
Sorry, I have to say, you've caught me short because I haven't seen the Department of Commerce regulations on commercial space. So I don't want to pretend to an answer that I don't have. I think I'm well known and well established as someone who believes that our national stature, national security, everything that we hold dear would be well served by doing all we can from the government perspective to enable and support commercial space entities. That said, there is only so much we can do in government. As I wish I could remember the authors of the quote, but two professors who I read their work at one point pointed out in a discussion of economics that when a technology or an enterprise is ready for commercialization, the government can't stop it. And when it isn't ready for commercialization, the government can't make it happen. And I think that's right. What we can do is we can lean forward with policies to make it as easy as possible for such establishments to thrive, and I'm certainly a supporter of that. But I'm not familiar with the latest DOC regulations, and so let's move on.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. If you're up for just a couple more, I know your voice might be running out. There are a few more in the queue. I really appreciate your patience. That folks are obviously hungry for the opportunity to interact with you.
No, I think we have another, 6 minutes scheduled, so I don't plan to cut you short.
Great. Thanks so much. Manu, please forgive me for butchering your name, but we have a question related to space situational awareness from Madukula. Are you ready to unmute your phone yourself, or would you like me to? You didn't actually post what the question was.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. I can.
Hi, Mike. This is Lika, not my longer version of the name.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I had a question related to space situational awareness, and this one is specific to, the sun is going through a second kind of deep minimum. We have high level of galactic cosmic rays, along with solar energetic particles that really impacts our environment. I'm not talking about deep space, but this interferes with all our technologies. And my question was, is there DoD investment interest in this area?
Well, we certainly are aware of the effects of, I'll just say broadly, the radiation spectrum on our satellites and other things that have to fly in space. We have hardening requirements for man-made nuclear prompt dose, for solar energetic protons, trapped electrons, trapped protons in the Van Allen belts, and galactic cosmic rays, both protons and heavy ions. So I just quickly stated there, I think about 6 things that we have to take into account. We have lapsed in our monitoring of the sun. I think, fortunately, ACE, Advanced Composition Explorer, out at the Sun Earth L1, I think is still working, but it's not going to work forever, and we do need to do a better job. Your word was space situational awareness, broadly expressed. That's the issue. And we do need to do a better job there. As with all of the things we need to do a better job on, it has to compete in the priority queue for other things.
Thanks, Mike. Deborah Factor had the next question. Deborah, can you ask your question?
Thanks, Aaron. Hey, Mike.
Hey, how you doing, Deborah?
I'm good, thanks. Glad you're doing well, too. So question on supply chain. a lot of concern in the Department of Defense about the vulnerability of supply chain and, innovative technology, manufacturing, access to critical components. And that was before all the COVID crisis. Do you have, or what would be your biggest concerns for the supply chain to deliver on the priorities that you have? And do you see the department taking any actions to support suppliers or small business, accelerated funding or other investments that or additional budget that might be coming?
Well, we were concerned about supply chain before the COVID pandemic, as you pointed out, and now we're quadruply concerned. I have to say that once again, I'm being asked a question that's kind of outside my swim lane. The entities which are spending the most time worrying about, what are the legal mechanisms by which we can help protect the supplier base. That's my colleague, Ellen Lord, who runs acquisition and sustainment. And then, of course, the three service acquisition executives, Bruce Jetty for the Army, Hondo Gertz for the Navy, Will Roper for the Air Force. Those are the executives who have frankly, the funding and the responsibility for making those determinations. R&E would likely be involved mostly if there were some technical issue where one of the SAEs or ANS wanted our involvement to discuss the technical merits of one potential supplier or technology versus another. But we're not front and center on protection of the industrial base.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Mike, we're at 10:29. Can we squeeze in one more question?
One more.
Okay, we have one more. That was emailed to me. How do you see reusable hypersonic systems supporting hypersonic weapons and hypersonic defense priorities?
I don't know. Someone should bring forward an architecture. I assume people are talking about multi-stage devices because, the last stage of a hypersonic weapon impacts hopefully a target. Certainly, I can absolutely envision that flyback first stages of such weapons could exist and could be economically efficient. That's not where we're going at the moment, but it's certainly not off the table. Okay. So I'll just leave it there.
Great.
Sorry, I can't give you a more definite answer, but I haven't seen anything put in front of me.
Got it. Thank you, Mike. And it is now 10:30. Gosh, you spanned the gamut in questions of all different topics. I hope that we correctly predicted the topics. I think we didn't quite nail it, but we really appreciate all the questions you fielded today. Wow. I think we got up to 105, 106 people participating at one point and still have just slightly less than 90 on the line now. I can't thank you enough for doing this for the WSBR community today, Mike. Thank you very much. Thanks again also to Northrop Grumman for sponsoring us. We really appreciate your thoughtful presentation and your time that you gave to our organization and still doing this, even though we're in a virtual environment. Like, we really appreciate it. And I think this concludes our event. We did record this, so we'll be putting it on our WSBR website later. And we'll hopefully, if this meets with our community's approval, we'll be doing another virtual event in the near future until this pandemic is behind us and we can meet again in person. So thanks for your time, Mike.
Well, thanks for having me. Take care, and we'll do it again.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Mike. Take care. Thanks to everyone.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks. Bye, folks. Have a good